we're going to start with one of the really big questions that the battle of ideas isn't averse to asking: what science actually can and can't tell us about the world. So we've assembled a top panel to bravely take this question head on.
So man, afraid, insecure, seeks to explain the world to himself, and for centuries and centuries produced mythical narratives of his origins, where the world is largely represented as a play of forces and experienced as a series of enchantments and possessions. Hierarchically, in all these narratives, man is subject to forces beyond his control. He's in the world, and his knowledge is a knowledge of how it feels to be in the world. It is not an absolute knowledge of things from outside. So in the 5th century BC, as we all know, Protagoras tells us that man is the measure of all things, of things which are, that they are, and things that are not, that they are not. Protagoras then setting man up for this position in a special relationship to the rest of nature. And two kinds of knowledge begin to emerge. The old kind, awareness, experience, the knowledge of being here, conditioned, subject, not in control. And then the attempt to measure from outside, from a stable position, unconditioned, hopefully seeking control. So, once central to public discourse, that older knowledge now becomes to be shared most of all aesthetically. And at this point, I'm hoping, yes, we've got a slide up here. Here's Tintoretto's George and the Dragon. And you can see here how mythic knowledge has been exiled into the realm of art and is barely considered real knowledge anymore. We have a beautiful princess in modern glamorous clothing, modern of the time, of course, runs frightened towards the viewer, while in the distance, George is rather smaller than one would expect, and his slaying of the dragon has a kind of nostalgic, mythical feel to us, as if Tintoretto's suggesting we know that George and the dragon aren't really there anymore, but the horror of the modern woman running towards us is. In this particular kind of knowledge, nothing is explained and no information is given. It is an appeal to shared knowledge, the knowledge we all know about being afraid of violence. Okay, now if we looked at this picture scientifically, of course, we'd be told that dragons had never existed anyway, that sainthood is meaningless, that the princess is overweight, that the chemical composition of the paint would be described to us, the operation of the light rays on the pigments, and more recently neuroscience would tell us which parts of our brains were active as we looked at it, and perhaps which parts of her brains were active as she ran away. And all this is absolutely fascinating and a huge achievement, but a completely different form of knowledge from the one expressed to us in the painting. Science's great advantage is that having actually understood elements of the world, it does offer us technology, the possibility of manipulating the world, which we're all extremely grateful for, and nobody wants to diminish that at all. We also reassure ourselves now that we have an unassailable story from the Big Bang right up to the present moment. Now, obviously, it's right and understandable that science push its methods and its descriptions to the limit and try and invade every possible territory it can. Why not? It would be bizarre if it didn't seek to do that. And we've heard how it is trying to do that. This is, by the way, nothing new. This was going on in the 19th century as it's going on today. One only needs to read the opening pages of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, where he refutes as ridiculous the notion that science can understand morality and prescribe morality. "Oh, you innocent babes," are Dostoevsky's words. Read the passage, it's wonderful. Let me just give you a banal example of the kind of difficulties science gets into here. We hear a great deal about the chemistry of sex and love, for example, the genetic and environmental factors that determine our choices of partners, how it happens, the millisecond in which we fall in love, etc., etc. But none of this is in any way commensurable with the knowledge of sex or the business of going through choice, saying yes or no. That knowledge is a different order, and you can read volumes of neuroscience, but if you haven't been between the sheets, of course, you'll still be a virgin. Nor does the science actually help you with that. Now, I just want to finish talking about Neuroaesthetics and Semir Zeki, a conference that I was present at. This is an attempt by neuroscientists to get their mind round art, and to understand what's happening in art and to offer us an explanation of our aesthetics. At this particular conference, Zeki was interested in ambiguity. He showed us the Rubin bars, you know, the two faces, where there's the bars, the two faces. He talked about the mind's difficulty dealing with ambiguity, and in fact was interested in suggesting that the kind of perception going on in art was of a kind that would help us to act more decisively and to breed more successfully. I did feel that this was the narrative that was entirely speculative, whereas his brain scans showing what's going on in the brain when one looks at ambiguous images is fascinating. I want to finish with 10 lines from Samuel Beckett then. 10 lines from Samuel Beckett talking about a man in the world trying to establish a point of security outside it. If you perhaps reflect what's going on in your mind as you read it, as I read it, and wonder whether science could grasp that. And in winter, under my greatcoat, obviously Beckett's Malloy is sleeping in a ditch, as Beckett's characters always do. In winter, under my greatcoat, I wrapped myself in swathes of newspaper. The Times literary supplement was admirably adapted to this purpose, of a never-failing toughness and impermeability. Even farts made no impression on it. I can't help it. Gas escapes from my fundament on the least pretext. It is hard not to mention it now and then, however great my distaste. One day I counted them. 315 farts in 19 hours, or an average of over 16 farts an hour. Well, after all, it's not excessive. 4 farts every 15 minutes, it's nothing. Not even 1 fart every 4 minutes. It's unbelievable, damn it. I hardly fart at all. I should never have mentioned it. Extraordinary how mathematics helps you to know yourself.
So I'm going to argue 2 things. I'm going to tell you that science, one of the things it can't tell you is what science can tell you or can't tell you, right? What? One of the things that science can't tell you is what science can't tell you, right? And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to tell you that what it can't tell you on its own, or it can tell you, it can't tell you on its own. So those are my 2 points. What do I mean by saying that it can't tell you about itself? I'm going to argue on 2 different levels that that's the case. The first level is on the personal level about scientists. In my view, and I'm willing to argue the toss on this one, scientists as individuals mostly lack reflexivity. What I mean by reflexivity is a sense of what it is they are doing themselves. So most of the time, if a scientist tells you what she's doing, she's wrong, right? I'll tell you a political way in which she's wrong a bit later, but unlike artists who spend a lot of time thinking about their practice, even the word practice is not used in science, scientists are not trained to think about what they're doing, and mostly they don't know what they're doing, right? That's my first claim. Secondly, science as a discipline is not one that looks at itself, right? So I work for Wellcome Trust, which is a fabulous funding organisation. My own view, and make it clear that I'm speaking neither as a sponsor nor as a representative of Wellcome Trust here, right? I'm speaking my own views here. People like Wellcome who fund things undervalue the social sciences and the kinds of softer sciences that we might think about in terms of how they decide what science should or shouldn't address. The question of whether you should fund things through peer review or not through peer review, the questions of what the challenges that face you as a scientific funding organisation, what the priorities for science are, these are not scientific questions. In other words, they are not questions which can be addressed by scientific method. They are political, social, technical questions. But when faced with questions like that, the kind of technocratic approach which a lot of funding organisations take, which is that we will do it well because we're smart. And in fairness, my first visit to Silicon Valley was to a thing at Google last year at the Googleplex called Sci-Fu, and I was frankly horrified by the unspoken axiom of the work that they do, including the philanthropic work, which is that if you give smart people enough resources, they can solve any problem. And it seems to me that it was neither smartness nor resources that indicated that the Nazi or the Pol Pot enterprise was flawed. You need to have some thinking about what it is you're doing. And the kind of thinking you need to have about what you're doing is not scientific thinking, right? It's political, social thinking. It's thinking about narrative, and you need ideas. So how does science work? And when I'm talking here, I'm referring to John Durant's 3 things the public need to know about science. There are scientific facts, When I commissioned stuff at Wellcome Trust in terms of public engagement, the most recent thing we did was a Darwin-inspired experiment for every school child in Britain. To be honest, I'm not that interested in the facts. I'm pretty sanguine about knowledge of that sort, although I do think it would be better if people had more of it, but it seems to me relatively unimportant. The second thing that Durant thought was important was how science works, and that's about evidence, risk, the structure of experiments, and I think that is also quite important. But it seems to me that in determining the limits of what science can tell us, it's Durant's third thing, how science really works, that we need to focus on. So in my final moments, I want to tell you a couple of things about how science really works. The first element of that is what I call, and I think it's original, the fractal theory of interdisciplinary boundaries. What is the fractal theory of interdisciplinary boundaries? I know times have moved on, but when I was growing up, we all knew what fractals were, but if you don't think about the coastline of Britain, it's wiggly if you look at the whole of Britain. You zoom into 100 kilometres, it's still wiggly. You zoom into 1 kilometre, it's still wiggly. You zoom into 1 metre, it's still wiggly. You zoom into 1 millimetre, it's still wiggly. That's a fractal. It's got structure at many scales. Notice that a font on a computer screen isn't like that. As you zoom into the letter A, you eventually get to a straight line. There's no structure when you zoom in tight enough. Interdisciplinary boundaries are fractal, which is to say that as you zoom in, the same forces are at work. What are these forces that preserve interdisciplinary boundaries? They're forces like jargon, like coterie conferences, which you invite only your friends to. They're like journals, which only people who think like you are invited to publish in. And that's the way that science works. Science determines the limits of its knowledge by the kind of banter and protectionism which defines interdisciplinary boundaries, and these function at the art-science divide. They function at the boundaries of chemistry and biology. They function at the difference between biology and neurobiology. Within neurobiology, it's systems neurobiology versus molecular neurobiology. Within systems neurobiology, between visual and auditory. Within visual, between higher order and lower order. The same features are at work. The limits of what science can tell us are policed by political discussions about the limits of authority of coterie groups, and that's probably okay. That's the way that nature functions. There are power struggles, and one of the issues about neuroaesthetics is precisely a power struggle. A quick history of neuroscience, and I think it's a case in point because it's kind of where we're at with the limits of what science can tell us, and this will be my final point, that it can't tell us what it can tell us on its own. Last century, neuroscience, or the study of the brain, shall we say, was divided into two camps. There were people who studied brains in vats, so that was me. In my PhD, I had anaesthetised, paralysed cats. I looked at their visual cortices with cameras that looked at their neural functioning, and that's as close as you can get to a brain in a vat without a vat, right? I mean, it was an anaesthetised, paralysed cat. It wasn't doing anything very interesting. On the other side, there were people who studied the interesting stuff, behaviour and so on. A lot of them had what they called a black box theory. They were behaviourists. They explicitly disavowed interest in what was going on inside the head. You'll forgive me, my favourite behaviourist joke: two behaviourists in bed, one says to the other, "That was great for you, how was it for me?" Right? Okay. So that's how we were in the last century. But since the decade of the brain, which was the 1990s, and on into the current century, neuroscience has allowed itself to treat of wider and wider range of questions. Neuroscience has allowed itself to ask these questions, and we should allow it to do so, but we shouldn't allow it sway over two things. One is we shouldn't allow it to set policy in the areas which it determines, in other words, how the brain functions. We shouldn't allow it, no one's actually arguing for this right now, but we shouldn't allow the neuroscientists to set, for example, an educational agenda, nor, and this is more important, should we allow politicians to pretend that it can, because that would be using our work under false premises. And the second thing is that we shouldn't allow science to try and tell us things on its own. We need to learn as scientists from the people outside science who are also experts in the things we're interested in, and if we don't engage with them, then we will tell the world very little that's interesting and important. Thank you very much.
I fully agree with Daniel that science can't necessarily tell you a lot of things on its own, and that there are boundaries between questions that are fundamentally ones to which there is a scientific answer and ones to which there isn't, and I will come back to that. What I wanted to pick up from Tim was two things he said that I think aren't true. The first one was he said science's great advantage is that it provides technology. I think that is a great advantage of science, but for me it's not actually the major one. The major advantage of science is the fact that it's provisional. It's the fact that it is evidence-based, and when the evidence changes, it can change its mind. Now, I fully appreciate, as Daniel said, that that is more of the theory than practice sometimes, and that there are cases where it doesn't happen. But the wonderful thing about science is it is okay to be wrong. If you have an idea that turns out to be wrong, that's fine, so long as you are prepared ultimately to change your viewpoint when the facts change. It's the ultimate John Maynard Keynes, when the facts change, I change my mind, what do you do? I think the other thing that Tim said that I disagreed with was when he said science produces findings that are unassailable. And once again, I think that's actually the reverse of what science does. The whole point about scientific thinking is that it is assailable. If you come up with evidence that provides a viable challenge to a point of view, then the scientific community as a whole, if not certain individuals within it, will over time change their viewpoint. What that means, of course, as well, is that authority has ultimately little place in science. It is not like a religion or like a method of thinking such as homeopathy, where everything's written down in Samuel Hahnemann's big book and that can't be challenged. It is a way of thinking where when new evidence appears, people will, if the evidence is good enough, change their minds and change their practice. A great example is Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, their discovery that ulcers are caused by a bacterium, not by stress. And this was initially thought to be a load of old rubbish, and they were ridiculed, but over time they produced the evidence that clearly convinced the medical community that they were right, the orthodoxy was wrong, and medical practice has changed accordingly. Now, I think that those are the great strengths of science, and that it's the fact that science knows to a large extent its limitations. It knows what it can't say. It knows that the findings that it throws out there are there to be bettered rather than the final word, that actually gives it its great strength and makes it, I think, such a powerful way of finding out about the world. Now, within that, however, there are clearly some things that science can't tell us, and I would agree with both Tim and Daniel when it comes to matters of aesthetics, matters of morality, matters of political ideology in particular. I think attempts to, certainly on the level of what we know about things like neuroscience and behavioural science and so on at the moment, I think attempts to extrapolate a morality from that, a scientific morality from that, are probably misguided. If we look at embryology, and particularly talking about embryonic stem cell research, now science can tell us a huge amount within this that is fundamentally descriptive. It can tell us what an embryonic stem cell is. It can tell us how an embryo develops. It can tell us the points at which various aspects of embryology that may have an influence on when we start to consider that embryo to be more or less human actually take place. It can also tell us an enormous amount about the potential medical utility of an embryonic stem cell. But what it can't do at the end of the day is to say whether that embryo, whether a 2-day or 5-day-old embryo is a human being or not. That is a decision that is there for every one of us to make as individuals. Incidentally, I don't think religion can tell us that either, but I think the difference is that science, I think properly done, doesn't profess to want to tell us that. Now, where that goes in the political debate over embryology, I think is interesting, because I personally, I mean, I'm not religious. I don't have a view that the embryo is a fully formed human being, and I therefore support embryonic stem cell research. That said, I can fully identify with and respect the position of somebody who takes a different view on the moral status of an embryo to the one I do. What I dislike, however, is when people argue from that moral viewpoint about the status of the embryo to start impinging on actually the scientific viewpoint of what an embryonic stem cell is. I think you'll find there are a lot of people out there who oppose embryonic stem cell research who will, instead of arguing that, well, look, I take the moral position that this is a fully formed human being, therefore it has the same rights as any born person does. That is often not sufficient for them. They will go on to say, well, and we can show, science can show that this embryo suffers pain. Or they will go on to say that embryonic stem cell research is unnecessary because you can achieve the same things with adult cells. Now that is what science can tell us, and that, to my mind at least, is where the political opponents of embryonic stem cell research are wrong. I don't think they're wrong on the morality issue. I just have a different morality to them. I hope that's helpful in terms of sort of setting out some of the parameters of what I think science can and can't tell. I think science, as Carl Sagan said, has as its great strength the fact that it's not a body of knowledge, it's a way of thinking. I think the more we think about that, the more we can realistically get to a point of working out what it can and can't tell us.
I mean, I did actually a history of art degree in between my medical training, and I was well aware of the kind of the adventures in two worlds that I was going through. That, yes, of course, as Marcus said, there are scientific things that one could say about that picture. If you're interested in the decay of pigment, it's very interesting if you wanted to know about the development of perspective. But as Tim has said, of course, you would learn nothing at all about what that picture is about. And I doubt that anyone has ever seriously argued the opposite. To understand, you know, the symbolic use of the dragon in Western art is not a scientific question. And it's absolutely fundamental to understanding Tintoretto, as it is to most of artists who use the figure of the dragon. And it's pointless to say, but dragons don't exist. Nobody thinks that they do. Tintoretto, by the way, didn't think they existed either, and he was perfectly well aware of that, and he was not using it in any form of literal sense, and would have thought you rather bonkers if you'd suggested that he was. And then Tim went on to say, and science, of course, tells you nothing about falling in love. And of course, scientists do sometimes say things like that. They do something. I mean, in the last 3 days, I don't know if you noticed, there was a paper from the University of Syracuse about the use of neuroimaging, and usually these papers always are about neuroimaging and showing, you know, bits of the brain that light up when you fall in love. There was another one from Caltech 2 days ago about what happens when you dream, or in particular that they can use neuroimaging to say what you're dreaming about. Turns out it was Marilyn Monroe. What happens now? These are what we call Christmas BMJ pieces. Okay, they're not really meant to be taken seriously. Should they be taken seriously? Which they're not. The biggest critics are always fellow scientists, but most of us don't even bother because we know that this is Christmas BMJ, and their real only purpose is to tease and irritate people with liberal arts degrees, and occasionally force them to actually think a little bit about science. The limits of what we do then are about the questions that we ask. And if, you know, the questions that my group have been asking in the last few weeks, just had a quick think about it, we've done something on what is the contribution of genetics to depression. Now that's a scientific question. Not that genes cause depression, but what is the contribution of genes to depression? That's fine. We don't ask what's the purpose of depression. What is it that depression does in society and things like that. That's not really a scientific question. We had a paper published over the weekend on the best way to treat soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a legitimate question to us to ask and answer, not why do people go to war. Those are not scientific questions, and I don't think that any genuine scientist would even attempt to think that they were, and they would turn to all sorts of other people to indulge in those discourses. So it reminds me of what I also teach medical students, which is going to be my epitaph and my only contribution to science, which is this. It's called Wessely's Law, and it says this: science is easy and people are difficult. And what we do is the science, but the issue about people is a much more broad, much more tricky area that involves all sorts of things. It's not just about what science is about. Thank you.
I think one thing that you can sort of say is that the problem that has been drawn out by Tim and Daniel is, you know, when you're trying to look at the human being scientifically, you run into all sorts of problems. Because if you're going to do that, you have to treat the human being as a machine, because that's essentially the scientific explanation of things. is a reductionist approach to understanding the mechanisms by which things work. That's obviously going to lead to problems, and Tim's explained them quite clearly, that you can't use that method to explain art. It just doesn't make any sense to even try. But then again, Daniel says, well, neuroscience shouldn't get involved in education and the rest of it. But it is involved. And the thing is that if the questions we're being asked were scientific ones, as Simon's put forward, fair enough. But if they're political ones that then ask science to answer them, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. So if you look at the relationship between neuroscience and education, it is a political one, and the driver is politics, not science. The OECD did a 6-7 year study about what you could get out of neuroscience in terms of education, the driver of which being the failure of politicians to do anything successful with education, not the other way round. It was only after that neuroscience institutes were set up with that purpose in mind. To their credit, they've said, hold on a minute, don't claim too much for this yet, because we haven't really got anything to tell you. In other words, the relationship is entirely the wrong way around when politics and social pressures are driving scientific investigations into a question. And yet, also, the problem being that the basis upon which you even start to do that is a misunderstanding of what a human being is. And that's a challenge enough in itself to deal with. So in that respect, I think that you know it's no surprise then you get science called in on questions of climate change, population, and all the rest of it, because there's a failure in the realm of politics to be able to deal with questions. So politicians are looking for authority somewhere else, and that authority comes from the authority of science. But as soon as science gets drawn into that, it undermines its own authority because it can't answer those questions and comes up with a load of rubbish. It's very difficult for scientists to deal with people as democratic, thinking individuals who have different opinions. So instead you end up with scientists giving proclamations of what should or should not be done. And that leads to all sorts of problems. You know, when you look at the field of medical health, where you ask scientists, chief scientists, to come up with proclamations on what we should do about swine flu or whatever. It's an interesting story. Chief scientist's daughter was at a school where the kids had been on holiday to Mexico, which was where the epidemic, or however you want to describe it, seemed to emerge. Surprise, surprise, that school was shut down faster than you can think. And then before you know it, schools across the country were being shut down and it became government policy. So what's driving what? I mean, I get the suspicion that what's driving this is the sense that if you're a scientist asked to come up with some recommendation on what we should do about the possibility that this flu disease could turn into an epidemic of unspeakable proportions, you say, well, we can't tell you whether it's going to do that, so you better prepare just in case it does. Scientists are now being asked to cry wolf constantly, and as a result of which they undermine themselves, and then people start to distrust them. People start to back off from them. But, and this is the other side to it, and which is where I quite strongly disagree with the way Daniel put forward his presentation, that does not mean that you critique science and say that the critique of science sociologically is what you should teach about science in schools or anywhere else. You do not replace science with a critique of it, because science has told us things about the natural world, and it can. You just have to understand what it is and how it does it. The reductionist method, the answering answerable questions through the use of experimentation, laboratory method, and the theories that develop from that, is sound. It works, and we've learned a hell of a lot. So we shouldn't, chuck that out because we're worried about the problem we've got of mixing science with politics. That's a mistake, and that, unfortunately, is what's happened in terms of education in schools, where the politicians have got hold of it and they put that bit instead of teaching knowledge, which I do think we should do for kids. Give them the knowledge of what science has given us and let them work out what it means when they grow up.
About technology, I just do want to say that one of the reasons why we're fascinated in science is because, as has been suggested, it creates the conditions for altering the world. And that's why politics gets pulled into it. And that's why the whole negotiation for funds is so tricky between politics and science. It is absolutely inevitable that those two things go together. And they're going to have to fight out for a very long time. But just one last thing. When we were invited to read for this panel an article by Sam Harris about how science is going to resolve moral problems and then provide a prescriptive, as it were, social engineering for getting us to behave morally, then we are really looking at a kind of monumental ignorance.
I think, actually, thinking of humans as machines is not unhelpful at the end of the day. I think we are machines. The problem is we're so incredibly complicated machines that we are not going to be able to get to the bottom of what every single interacting part actually does. I think actually a form of reductionism does work at the end of the day. The problem is actually we're not going to be able to get all the way to it. But that doesn't mean that we can't answer some very important questions along the way.
Of course, the human body is a machine or a complex concatenation of machines. That is not the same as the human person, and we can talk about the difference, but there's an awful lot of differences. But it does seem to me out there, both within the humanities, believe it or not, and within the press at large, there is a belief that neuroscience and evolutionary theory are going to actually explain much more about us than was ever dreamed of. And if I could give you a list of the neuro-hyphenated humanities that are desperate to become animalities, so they can get some grants, then you will see there's neuroeducation, neuropolitics, neuroeconomics, neuroaesthetics, etc., etc. It's out there and it's getting bigger, and it seems to me that the humanities, which should be a bulwark against scientism, are capitulating and letting themselves be taken over. So thank you for the sanity we've had this morning. You're rarer than you think.
When I first sort of was introduced to the scientific method 30 years ago or so, it was exhilarating, and you found that it took away a lot of superstition, a lot of bad belief, and it brought you into a world where rationality seemed to prevail. But right now, there seems to be almost a decadence with science, to the point where you now feel you better not trust anything they're saying anymore. And what you now need to do is use your own intuition to navigate the whole scientific minefield.
I think it's fair enough that a couple of people have said, well, actually, by treating human beings as machines or a concatenation of machines, you can do all sorts of useful things. But obviously then there is a stage where you can't treat human beings, human persons, as Ray rightly said, as machines, because we have opinions and thoughts and ideas, and we are able to act upon our world as well as just be acted upon by it. And science cannot necessarily tell us in what context the being treated as a machine is useful, and in what context it's a kind of wrong and limiting view of human beings. But I think it would also be wrong to put all the blame on scientists for this reductionist view of people. I think, on the contrary, the fact that people are saying, oh, well, we could use brain scans to tell us whether people are guilty in trials, or we can use brain scans to tell us why women go off sex, which I think is the study you were talking about. But the reason why these things are being seized upon is not because scientists are suddenly evilly taking over the world. It's because everybody else has lost faith in human beings as being anything more than machines. They've lost faith in the fact that actually humans can act upon the world in positive ways and think in ways that are rational, but not entirely based on scientific evidence. I just want to say about these papers published about science and morality and death of responsibility and so on, and the illness of science, etc. There is clearly a drift in the kind of articles that reach the general public. In the New York Times, where I read a lot of scientific articles and so on, there's generally a drift towards all forms of determinism, which interestingly tend to be really genetic determinism rather than even simply looking at the environment. So I think there is a drift there, and I'm afraid the man may be right that one day somebody will say that these articles are not bollocks. I'm afraid that may happen.
We make structures in our heads, okay, based on how we see the world. We construct our realities. Our brains are predictive machines which try to explain how things happen. If our understanding of the brain, informed by neuroscience, makes us think of each other as different, then we will start to behave differently, right? In other words, the understanding we have of the world, of what it means to be human, which neuroscience can inform, will change how we act and how we feel, and how we act and how we feel is the basis of morality. So there is a mechanism by which neuroscience can influence what we do, because it will influence how we see the world. And as we start to see the world differently, we will behave differently. So I think there is a mechanism there, and that's why we have to continue doing brilliant neuroscience in order to give politicians the best evidence they can to choose what we do next.
In terms of morality, I do think that some of the scientific work on the roots of a universal morality is interesting, and I think it is starting to suggest that there are ways in which humans tend to judge issues such as fairness rather similarly, and that there do seem to be some universals out there. I think it's a big jump, though, to move from that to the idea that morality can be in some ways determined scientifically, because I really don't think it can. There are too many variables involved, and we're not going to get to the bottom of them all.
And we've done several studies looking at religion and suicide, and we showed that the intensity of religious belief was very protective against suicidal intent and indeed completed suicide. That seems to me a completely legitimate form of inquiry and quite useful. But the form of inquiry that unfortunately is also done but is utterly unuseful is there's been a whole series of randomised controlled trials in the last few years. You may have read about them, about the power of prayer, of people randomly allocated to be prayed for. They're all American, by the way. They are, actually, it's true. And that seems to me, disregarding the kind of blasphemous aspect of actually what they're actually doing is testing God in a randomised controlled trial. But that is what they're doing. That's what they're doing. But the thing that always amuses me about them is, given the fact that God is generally considered to be omnipotent, how on earth they ever did a power analysis.
When I sat on the House of Commons Select Committee for Education, being asked how we can get kids to learn science, the chairman was banging on about, well, can't neuroscience tell us how to do it? Isn't there a way, a magic way somewhere? So we're always trying to find these tricks, these ways in which to skirt around problems, and that's the danger. And unfortunately, Daniel seems to have tripped himself into that same thing in terms of neuroscience will change how we act. Well, yeah, that's entirely true, because a lot of people want it to change how we act. They want to see us as people who are not driven by will and by free will, but who are, driven by our way our brains are wired and way our genes work, and that's it. In fact, the common argument I have with some scientists behind closed doors is there's no such thing as free will. It's an illusion that's given to us by evolution, and that's just it. Hard luck. Right? Well, if that's the explanation that science has for human beings, I don't want it. Thank you.